The Second World War was a period of extreme devastation, where millions of lives were lost and countless atrocities were committed. Among the many dark chapters of this war, one of the most harrowing and brutal events that is still remembered to this day is the Bataan Death March. This was not just an isolated moment in history, but a series of horrors that affected thousands of soldiers, and it continues to serve as a grim reminder of the inhumanity that war can bring. The Bataan Death March is a testimony to the cruelty of war and the incredible resilience of those who survived it. The story of the Bataan Death March begins with the strategic importance of the Philippines. The islands, located in the Pacific, were crucial for both the United States and Japan. For the United States, the Philippines was an essential base for its naval and air power in the Pacific. If Japan could seize the Philippines, it would cut off crucial supply lines for the United States, giving Japan the upper hand in the Pacific theater. On the other hand, Japan needed the Philippines to secure its resource supply routes, particularly for oil, which was essential for its war machine. The Philippines were strategically located along the primary shipping lanes from the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, vital sources of oil. If the United States had control of these islands, Japan's access to these resources would be severely hampered, making it imperative for Japan to secure them at any cost. At the time, the Philippines were a semi-independent commonwealth under United States rule, with full independence planned for 1946. However, the islands were far from prepared for the Japanese invasion. Despite the strategic importance of the region, the United States military had not fully equipped the local forces, and they were left to face a much larger and more powerful Japanese military. The United States was already spread thin, engaged in fighting across multiple fronts, and had committed to a defeat Germany first strategy. This meant that the Philippines were not a priority, and the local military forces were underprepared to repel the Japanese invasion. When Japan launched its attack on the Philippines on December 8, 1941, only hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States and Filipino forces were caught off guard. The Japanese advance was swift and overwhelming, and within a matter of weeks, they captured Manila, the capital of the Philippines. The American and Filipino forces, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, were forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, a strategically significant location where they hoped to make a stand. However, this was not an easy retreat. The soldiers, already exhausted from the initial fighting and facing severe shortages of supplies, were in poor condition. They were forced to leave behind valuable resources, including food, ammunition, and equipment, as they retreated into the jungle. The situation was made worse by a lack of air support, as most of the United States planes in the region were destroyed in Japanese air raids. This left the defenders isolated and without any hope of immediate relief. As the soldiers retreated into Bataan, they found themselves facing an increasingly difficult situation. The terrain was rugged, and the jungle provided little protection from the intense tropical heat and disease. The soldiers were already suffering from malnutrition and exhaustion, with many falling ill due to the unsanitary conditions. The Japanese, on the other hand, were better equipped and better prepared for this kind of warfare. They had superior numbers, and their forces were bolstered by their air and naval superiority. The Americans and Filipinos were left to fight on for survival, but the odds were against them. The Battle of Bataan began on January 6, 1942, and it quickly became clear that the defenders could not hold out for long. Despite their bravery and determination, the soldiers were facing extreme shortages of food, water, and medical supplies. Their weapons were outdated, and many of them were malfunctioning due to the lack of proper maintenance. The fighting was intense, and the soldiers were forced to endure extreme conditions. They were on half rations, and the constant stress of battle, combined with the disease and lack of proper care, led to a rapid decline in their ability to fight effectively. After several months of fierce combat, with no signs of relief in sight, General MacArthur was ordered to leave the Philippines. This was one of the most difficult decisions of his career, and it came under immense pressure from Washington. The United States government feared that MacArthur's capture would be a devastating blow to American morale, and they believed that his presence in Australia could be crucial in organizing the war effort there. MacArthur left behind a broken and exhausted force in Bataan, and he famously said, "I came through, and I shall return." While this provided some hope, the soldiers in Bataan were left to fend for themselves, now under the command of Major General Jonathan Wainwright. By the time of MacArthur's departure, the defenders of Bataan were already at the breaking point. The Japanese forces, led by Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma, resumed their offensive in early April, and with the Americans and Filipinos already starving and suffering from disease, it was only a matter of time before they would be forced to surrender. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King, the commander of all ground forces on Bataan, made the painful decision to surrender. This marked the largest surrender in United States military history, and it was a devastating blow to the Allied forces in the Pacific. The surrender, however, was not the end of the ordeal. What followed was a journey of unimaginable suffering, one that has become a symbol of the cruelty and brutality of war. The prisoners were forced to endure what became known as the Bataan Death March. After the surrender of the American and Filipino forces on the Bataan Peninsula, the nightmare that followed became one of the most horrific episodes of World War II. The Bataan Death March was not merely a forced relocation of prisoners, but a journey of unimaginable cruelty that claimed the lives of thousands of men. This chapter in history stands as a grim reminder of the inhumanity of war and the depths to which some can sink when faced with power and hatred. The prisoners of war were not given any time to recover or even rest. They were immediately taken on a brutal, forced march that covered a distance of more than 60 miles from the Bataan Peninsula to a train station at San Fernando. This march, which lasted for several days, became one of the most infamous events of the war, marked by extreme physical abuse, starvation, and psychological torture. The conditions were appalling, and the Japanese captors showed no mercy. The prisoners, numbering between 72,000 and 78,000 men, were already in a state of severe physical exhaustion and malnutrition due to the months of fighting and poor living conditions. Many were suffering from diseases such as malaria, dysentery, and beriberi, making the march even more excruciating. The Japanese soldiers who guarded the prisoners treated them with unrelenting cruelty. The men were forced to march under the scorching tropical sun with little water and no food. The guards would beat, stab, and shoot anyone who faltered or fell behind. Those who could not keep up with the pace were often bayoneted or left to die by the side of the road. It was common for prisoners to be beaten with rifle butts or stabbed with bayonets if they stumbled or stopped for even a brief moment. What made the march even more nightmarish was the utter disregard for human life shown by the Japanese soldiers. The prisoners were denied basic human needs such as food, water, and rest. There were no provisions for their health or safety. As they marched, they passed artesian wells, but any attempts to drink from them were met with violence. Prisoners were often shot if they tried to drink from the wells, despite the fact that they were suffering from severe dehydration. They were forced to march in sweltering heat for hours, sometimes with no break at all. The psychological toll on the prisoners was equally devastating. Those who survived the initial onslaught of violence found themselves in a state of complete despair. Many were left to witness the brutal deaths of their comrades. The march became a journey, not just of physical endurance, but of the will to survive. Yet, for many, survival was simply not an option. The violence was not limited to just the guards. Civilian onlookers, including local Filipinos, who attempted to offer aid to the prisoners, were also brutally punished. Some Filipinos who tried to give food or water to the men were executed by the Japanese soldiers, reinforcing the idea that the suffering of the prisoners was deliberate and systematic. The guards, influenced by the Bushido Code, which held that surrender was a disgrace, viewed the prisoners not as soldiers but as unworthy enemies. To them, the prisoners were not human. They were simply obstacles in their path to victory. The Bushido Code emphasized honor and the rejection of weakness, and to the Japanese soldiers, the prisoners had dishonored themselves by surrendering. As the prisoners moved forward on the march, the brutal conditions led to a staggering loss of life. Many died from heat stroke, exhaustion, dehydration, and the injuries inflicted by the guards. Others succumbed to the diseases that had plagued them during their time on Bataan. The bodies of those who died during the march were often discarded along the roadside, left to rot in the tropical heat. The journey, which should have been a straightforward military operation, became a macabre procession of death. The death toll during the Bataan Death March was staggering. Estimates vary, but it is believed that as many as 10,000 Filipino soldiers and approximately 1,000 American soldiers died during the march. These deaths were not simply due to the effects of war, but were the result of an organized campaign of cruelty and neglect. The Japanese soldiers were not just indifferent to the suffering of the prisoners, they actively contributed to it. The prisoners were treated as nothing more than tools of war, discarded when no longer of use. The march did not end at the Bataan Peninsula. Once the prisoners reached San Fernando, they were crammed into overcrowded boxcars for the next leg of their journey. These boxcars, designed to carry a small number of people, were packed with far more than their capacity. It is said that over 100 prisoners were crammed into each boxcar, with barely any space to move. The heat inside was unbearable, and many prisoners perished from suffocation and heat exhaustion before they even reached their next destination. Upon arriving at Capas, the survivors were forced to march yet another 7 miles to a prison camp known as Camp O'Donnell. The journey had already taken a devastating toll on the prisoners, and the conditions at the camp would only worsen their suffering. For those who survived the march and the subsequent rail transport, life at Camp O'Donnell was far from a reprieve. The camp, a former Philippine Army training facility, was completely unprepared to house the vast number of prisoners that arrived. It lacked basic sanitation and medical facilities, and the prisoners were crammed into overcrowded barracks. The conditions at Camp O'Donnell were nothing short of hellish. The Bataan Death March stands as a testament to the brutality of war and the extreme suffering that so many endured. For those who survived, it was a traumatic experience that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The memory of the Bataan Death March is not just a part of history. It is a powerful reminder of the importance of remembering the atrocities of the past so that such horrors are never repeated. The Bataan Death March left deep scars on the survivors, both physically and emotionally. For many of the men who endured the march, the brutality they experienced was not something that could be easily erased. Their suffering did not end with the march itself. After arriving at the infamous Camp O'Donnell, the survivors faced even harsher conditions that would claim more lives. Camp O'Donnell was an overcrowded prison camp that became the final resting place for many of the men who had survived the march. Initially, it was designed to hold about 9,000 prisoners, but by the time the prisoners of the Bataan Death March arrived, the camp was housing around 50,000 men. The camp lacked the basic necessities of life, such as sufficient food, water, medical supplies, and proper sanitation. As a result, the conditions were horrific. Prisoners slept on hard bamboo floors without proper bedding. The camp was plagued by diseases, including dysentery, malaria, and beriberi, and the prisoners were malnourished, receiving only minimal rice and sometimes a small portion of water buffalo meat. The situation at Camp O'Donnell was dire, with a staggering death toll. Thousands of men who had already endured the brutality of the Death March now succumbed to the horrific conditions at the camp. It is estimated that approximately 1,500 American soldiers and around 20,000 Filipino soldiers died in just a few months due to starvation, disease, and the continued brutality of the guards. The camp became a place where death was ever present, and the survivors were left to witness the daily loss of their comrades. As the death toll continued to rise, the United States government, in response to the horrifying conditions, decided to close Camp O'Donnell for American prisoners in June of 1942. The American prisoners were then moved to another camp, Camp Cabanatuan. While conditions there were somewhat better, the camp was still overcrowded, and disease continued to spread. Prisoners still suffered from malnutrition, lack of proper sanitation, and insufficient medical care. Even at Cabanatuan, many men died from the same conditions that had claimed so many lives at O'Donnell. However, for those who managed to survive the prison camps and the forced labor, a new nightmare awaited. Many of the remaining prisoners were put aboard what became known as hell ships. These ships were used to transport Allied prisoners of war to Japan or to other parts of the Japanese Empire, where they were forced into hard labor. The conditions aboard these ships were appalling. Prisoners were packed into the cargo holds like cattle, with no space to move, no ventilation, and very little access to food and water. As the journey stretched on, many prisoners perished from starvation, disease, and suffocation. The hell ships were notorious for their overcrowding and the brutal conditions that prisoners endured during transport. Tragically, these transports were sometimes targeted by Allied forces. The ships, which were often unaware that they were carrying prisoners, became targets for submarines and aircraft. As a result, many Allied prisoners were killed during these attacks, further adding to the death toll. The sinking of the Junyo Maru in September of 1944 stands as one of the most tragic examples of this friendly fire. Over 6,000 prisoners, including over 1,500 American soldiers, perished when the ship was sunk by a British submarine. Despite the suffering, the survivors of the Bataan Death March and the subsequent imprisonment eventually found themselves liberated, though the scars they carried would last a lifetime. The liberation of the prisoners came at a high cost, and by the end of the war, it is estimated that only about 1/3 of the men who were part of the original Bataan Death March survived. The aftermath of the Bataan Death March was not just about physical survival. It was also about seeking justice for the men who had endured such unspeakable horrors. In the post-war years, the survivors of the march began to push for accountability. They wanted to ensure that those responsible for the brutality and abuse faced justice. One of the central figures in the prosecution of war crimes was Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma, who had commanded the Japanese forces that invaded the Philippines and oversaw the Bataan Death March. Homma was arrested by American forces in September of 1945 and brought to trial. During the trial, he was charged with war crimes, particularly the brutal treatment of prisoners of war. Homma maintained that he had no knowledge of the atrocities committed against the prisoners until after the fact. He described himself as a moderate, even compassionate leader, but the testimony of the survivors contradicted this claim. The prosecution presented evidence that showed that Homma's forces had intentionally mistreated the prisoners, leading to their suffering and death. In February of 1946, Homma was convicted and sentenced to death by firing squad. Despite attempts by his family to appeal the verdict, Homma was executed on April 3, 1946. His execution was seen by many as a necessary step in holding war criminals accountable, even though some critics claimed that the trial was unfair due to the involvement of General Douglas MacArthur in the proceedings. Regardless, Hama's execution symbolized the international community's commitment to holding individuals responsible for the atrocities committed during the war. For the survivors, the journey toward healing was long and difficult. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, though at the time, it was simply referred to as battle fatigue. Survivors often struggled with feelings of guilt for having lived when so many of their comrades had perished. The emotional scars left by the brutality of the Death March and the camps were profound. Some survivors, like Lester Tenney, found a sense of peace through forgiveness, recognizing that not all individuals shared the same wartime mindset. Others dedicated their lives to telling their stories, ensuring that the horrors of the Bataan Death March would not be forgotten. The legacy of the Bataan Death March is one of both suffering and resilience. It is remembered today through various memorials and commemorations, ensuring that future generations understand the immense sacrifices made by the men who endured the march. In the Philippines, April 9 is observed as Araw ng Kagitingan, or Day of Valor, a national holiday to honor the fallen soldiers. In the United States, monuments, plaques, and even annual events, such as the Bataan Memorial Death March held at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, continue to pay tribute to the men who survived and those who did not. The Bataan Death March remains one of the darkest chapters of World War II, a testament to the horrors of war and the endurance of the human spirit. It is a story of tragedy, but also of triumph over adversity. The bravery and sacrifice of the men who endured the march and the efforts to bring those responsible to justice ensure that their legacy lives on. The Bataan Death March will forever be remembered as a solemn reminder of the need to protect human dignity and never forget the atrocities of the past.